We good? All right. Thank you guys all for your patience. I apologize for that. That's not a good way to start. My name is Trenton Ivy. Tonight I'm going to be talking about mutating malware. My contact information is up here. I can give it to you afterwards if you'd like it. I would love to have anybody else that wants to collaborate on this come and talk to me afterwards. Just a quick history on me. I'm not going to bore you too much with who I am. But I started hacking at a young age. I absolutely love hacking. I love trying to figure out how things work, but I never thought I could make a career out of it. So I decided I'd become a doctor, which is probably a bad idea because I thought biology and chemistry was all about trying to solve things and figure things out. And it is to some extent. But when I went to the medicine field, it became much more about rote memory and procedure. And I kind of lost this vision of what I thought my life was going to become when I became a doctor. And all of a sudden, this hacking hobby became way more fun and way more addicting. And so I, at the end of my undergrad, I decided I'd go ahead and take a break and go to Africa for a little while and work in a hospital. And so while I was there, I got the opportunity to work in a lab, do rotations with doctors, get to see a lot of medical things firsthand. But it was a hospital in remote Africa, and so their systems were all like Windows 98 and XP, and this was like 3 or 4 years ago. And they had a different type of virus and sickness. And I ended up spending a lot of my afternoons trying to repair the computers and make them better instead of a lot of the patients, because I was one of the few people there that knew how to do so. And I came back at that experience and said, I absolutely love this. This is what I want to do. And so I ended up getting a job doing tech at a hospital. From there, I became a consultant at a group called 403 Labs. And then currently now, I am a pen tester on our network exploitation and research department for a Fortune 500 company. So that's me in a nutshell, and kind of maybe hopefully that helps you at least see a little bit of why my interests are where they are. So I am not the smartest person in the room. This is one of my first times giving a talk at a big convention like this, as is evident by the snafu that started it off. I'm not a bio expert. I did get my undergrad in bio, but that doesn't make me an expert. I am definitely not a doctor. Please don't ask me to diagnose anything that you may think you have or somebody else says they may think you have. And I'm not an antivirus expert. I look at it from the perspective of an attacker. I love to break things. I'm a breaker before I'm a builder. And I think that if you want to know the true or find a true antivirus expert, you got to go talk to people that are building this stuff. That said, hopefully I can still provide some information that's interesting. So tonight I'm going to try to, and I'm going to see if I can still get you out on time. So I'm speaking fast. I apologize. If you have any questions, just raise your hand. I'll go back and say something again. Tonight I'm going to take a quick look at some of the similarities between biology and technology. And I have to grab my notes here. I'm also going to give a quick primer on antivirus evasion. I'm going to look at a lot of the different techniques that are used and how we can make some of them work better. I'm also going to give a primer on genetic algorithms. If I have time, throw in a few demos, and maybe talk about where we should go from here next. This talk is not about AV bashing. I know, I hear an O back there. AV is tough, and that's why I say I don't want to pick on it. It's like picking on well, I won't use that analogy because this is being recorded, but so AV is tough. It's a hard thing to get right? There is no such thing as perfect AV, and so the goal is to get as close as possible to that. And so part of what this discussion is how can we migrate the way that we think about AV to make it better? So with that, I want to start with a quick little history lesson in the way that we view pathogens and how that's changed over time. So if we go back to, and I've got to use my cheat sheet here, in 1847, there was a Hungarian obstetrician who noticed that doctors and med students, when they gave birth, the woman ended up dying quite a bit more than if the midwife had been involved and been the only person to have any contact with the woman. And he kind of wondered, why is it? Like, there's this strong connection between doctors and death, essentially, in this case, and the midwives and life. And so he started doing some experiments and found that by doing things like washing hands and making sure that when they went from a sick patient to go deliver babies, that they changed gowns and gloves and things like that. And the rate of death dropped significantly. And so that was the first time that there was kind of this idea of sickness being, and not the first time, but one of the times in which scientifically they realized sickness is something that we can try to control through other means. It's something that somebody has. For the longest time, people have had really weird ideas about what sickness was, if you look back through history, right? Some people thought, evil spirits. In fact, in Africa, some people still believe that. There were some tribes that weren't too far away from where I lived who had a witch doctor, and that's where people went for medical advice. And it made it very difficult for the actual doctors there to say, no, you don't need to take salt and rub it underneath, or it was actually bleach. They were using like Clorox bleach to rub it under babies' mouths as a way to heal them, which is awful. But and it's like, but that's when you have, it's not because they were trying to be bad. It was just because they had a lack of understanding. Another mentality. Or another thought with sickness was seeds, right? There's a seed, and if you happen to be in a state in which that seed can grow, then that sickness will grow. Another concept was worms, right? It wasn't until Louis Pasteur in 1860 performed experiments that actually linked diseases with microorganisms. So in 1895, I'm going to try to hurry through this, a scientist documented that mold had antibacterial action. The mold was penicillin. However, it was hard to purify. They couldn't use it for anything, so it was kind of noted, and it didn't get much use for quite a while. 1939 was the start of World War II. They had 2 antibiotics available, gramicidian, which couldn't be used systemically because it would cause toxic shock, so they had to use it locally, and Pronazil, which was only targeted a little subset of bacteria. So it was great for the bacteria that it was meant for, but terrible for everything else. And so, World War II continues on. 2 scientists finally succeeded in purifying penicillin. The very next year, some scientists said, hey, we're realizing that if this penicillin is being used with bacteria, some of them are going to start to show resistance. So fast forward even further now, right? How many people in the room have used penicillin or some other type of antibiotic? Right? We give it to everybody. It's one of those interesting game theory things, right? If you give it to the individual, then it's good for the individual because it can help them get better. But from a society standpoint, it's not necessarily the best thing to do because all of a sudden now you have the chance of increase of resistance. I think what happened is a similar story, and I think we can learn a lot from biology and apply it to technology with antivirus. Right, here's a chart from AV Test. It shows the instances of new malware discovered. Right, so if you're like way over on the left, like there's absolutely nothing, and the way over to 2013, there's a ton. If we look at the history, right, the idea of viruses or malware goes all the way back to 1949. So this is when we still think that, like, from a biological standpoint, not long after, we're thinking that things are, spontaneously generated, right? But then they say, a scientific, I gathered in computer science, said, hey, there's this idea of this self-reproducing autonomous, form from a software standpoint. In 1970, it was actually realized with supposedly the first public virus, Creeper, was found on ARPANET. And it was really benign, I guess. It spread itself, and it popped up on your screen. It said, I'm the Creeper, catch me if you can. Ironically, somebody created another virus called Reaper to go and destroy Creeper. I have a huge list here, and I could go on, but since we got started late, I'm not going to go over too many of these. But for the 80s and most of what was found was pretty benign. In 1987, a computer scientist named Fred Cohen, he's a mathematician scientist, said that there is essentially no algorithm that can perfectly detect all possible viruses. And I think that's an important point. The same year was when the first 2 AV vendors released software. There was FluShot Plus and Anti4Us AV. The next year was when John McAfee and Eugene Kapersi happened to join a mailing list, right? And so there's this attempt to have this penicillin, if you will, and things kind of started going down from there. Not because we made AV, but because malware is becoming more popular, right? 88, you got the Morris Worm. 91, Michelangelo. 94, Cap A. 99, Melissa. 2001, Code Red. 2002, So Big, Buster, Slammer. 2004, My Doom. And things go on. The list goes on and on and on. And so here we are in 2013 with over 50 million. Got to count the zeros in my head. Oh boy, it's been a long day. 50 million new instances of malware. And we need to look at what got us here, right? So when we built computers, it wasn't how can we build something that's secure? It was, hey, this is cool. We can make two boxes, or a box crunch numbers. And for networking, it was a similar principle. It wasn't, how can we make two computers talk securely? It was, this is awesome. There's two computers in a different room and they're both communicating with one another. So security is always kind of an afterthought. And it oftentimes forgets to think about the future. I don't think that was the case with AV in terms of it being something that was ignoring security. I think it was always intended with security from the beginning. But I think that the future was something that was either couldn't be predicted and couldn't be planned for, or was just not considered, right? What we had at that time was an elegant solution for the problem at that time. But essentially, you have many systems with a few amount of malware, and now we have a whole lot of malware with comparatively few systems, and so the problem has changed. So what most of you probably have come for is how to get past AV. So that's kind of the biology side. I'll reference it in a little bit, but for now I want to look at how we can get past AV. And so before we can get past it, we kind of have to understand how we get caught first. So there are three different methods that, well, there are probably more, but we can generalize them as three different methods as to how AV finds malicious software or code. First is hashes, second is byte signatures, and the third is heuristics. If you look at hashes, there are three different types of hashes that get used. The first is a traditional hash. So if you think of like an MD5 sum of a file, right? This is a really, really efficient way to find a malicious file. What's the problem with this? Anybody? Right, you change one bit and the entire thing changes, right? So that doesn't do a lot of good. Maybe back in the 80s when stuff wasn't mutating itself or changing, there was no polymorphic code and things were relatively simple, that was fine. But that's totally broken now, right? Doesn't work hardly at all. So the next idea is sectional hashes. So this breaks the code up into segments. Usually you see it from like, if you look at the code level, you see like the data and the text segments, and you get a different hash for each one of those. That's better. That can avoid things like the way that you compiled it coming into question when you're trying to get a signature to work. But ultimately, we still have the same problem, right? We have this big hash, and minor changes in the code can result in the signature being broken. Finally, there's fuzzy hashes, or sometimes you can hear them called as perceptual hashes, and these are actually really, really cool. I had a problem where I had to go and categorize what a whole bunch of websites looked like. I had thousands of websites, and I had to kind of quickly target. And so what I ended up using is perceptual hashes. I took in-map script to scan the entire range, pulled down an image of everything, and then took a perceptual hash of that. And then I ordered those perceptual hashes. Unlike cryptographic hashes, perceptual hashes are the closer something is, the closer the hashes are. So this is actually really, really cool for AV. The problem is code is getting so much more complex, and there are so many uses for so many of the functions that AV use, right? So we can just start to hide things to make it look legit. Somebody once told me when I was learning lock picking that the best pick for any lock is the key, right? So if we can make something look legitimate, we can avoid things by this because it will be off slightly, but it can still do whatever we want it to do. So these are, of the three different types of hashes, this is by far the best, but it's still not perfect. Next major category is byte signatures. So if we look at this is an example of just a byte sequence, right? So this is great if you have a piece of shellcode that you know the byte signature for, you know it's going to be bad, and you have a good reason to believe that that's not going to show up in anything else legitimate, right? Or there's a very low chance of that. So this is good, but I'll get to why that can be really, really bad. If we rely on that alone. And then finally, heuristics. So heuristics look at actions that actually occur. This is where a lot of AV is moving, and this is probably the best solution that's out there right now. But there are some reasons why this doesn't work either, and I'll get into that in a little bit later. But here's an example. I know it's a little bit small, I apologize, but heuristics for poison ivy, right? So it looks for a Windows API call to a function with a certain string. It looks for another API call with another string, and then another API call. And it says if A and B and C, then we know that this is poison ivy because nothing else does this or has any reason to do that. Oops, I could have made it bigger. Nope, not going to go there. Next question is, when does it happen? When do we get caught? So file access, right? AV will actually scan on file. This is when you need the full file scan, right? This is pretty good. It takes Actually, I'm sorry, file access is when it opens a file, right? So as it opens a file, it'll throw it into some type of sandbox, review the code, and then say either yes or no, and then you can access it or you can't. A full system scan is similar. It's looking for those hashes to see if anything else can match. And then finally, heuristics triggers. So it's either at runtime or while it's in some type of sandbox trying to review the code in the first place. So with that as just kind of a really brief background, I want to look at some of the common techniques that you can use to get past AV. So the first I'd say is encode. Does anybody use Metasploit encoders? A lot of people use those to try to get past AV, and it's kind of convenient that they do, but they never really were intended to get payloads past AV. The intent was to get your shellcode into a format that it can be added to a buffer or to whatever your target is, such that it will get accepted, right? And so it's great because it messes with the code, and you can oftentimes use it to get past AV. The problem with an encoder is that you have to have something to encode or decode it with, right? And so a lot of AV will write signatures for the decoder portion of the AV. So that's good, but if you take like a Metasploit payload, like the Windows EXE or whatever, something simple, right? And you encode it a bunch of times, take something completely benign and encode it a bunch of times, and then throw it to AV total or virus total, you'll get hits on it. Because it doesn't do anything bad. It's nothing bad, but it's catching that and says that's a Metasploit encoder. So the next is to encrypt. So this is really cool. You can use a legitimate package such as OpenSSL to encrypt your payload. Again, you have to have a way to decrypt that, but there's plenty of legitimate reasons to encrypt something with OpenSSL, right? So this is a great method to get stuff past AV. But the heuristics is what will end up usually catching this, right? So if you decrypt something and then you bind shell, yada, 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 then flag, right? The next one is compress. So there's a lot of packers out there. It's, let's zip it up, let's uncompress it and then run it, and let's do this all in memory so that AV doesn't catch it. And then next one is my personal favorite, script. So there's a new tool that's been released called Veil. It basically takes any payload that you want and it converts it into either Python or PowerShell. I think there's a few other ones, but that works almost 100% of the time. I have yet to find any AV product. If you guys know of any, please let me know. But they can accurately detect that type of method. So we'll see how long that lasts. But right now, that's probably even better than anything I'm going to talk about. So ghostwriting is what I'm actually here to talk about and what I'm hoping to evolve. So with ghostwriting, essentially what you're trying to do is you're looking at the actual shellcode. Ghostwriting is nothing new. I didn't make it up. It's been around. There was a paper that was published in 2011 on Exploit Database by a gentleman called, I forget his alias. I've got it in the sources. And then somebody else, Pentest Geek, someone on their blog did an excellent write-up on how to actually use it with Metasm. So nothing new, but the idea is if we change the bits around in the code enough, we can actually have execution occur in the exact same way, but end up having it so that the code is different. And so the best way to actually do this is if, cross your fingers, but we're going to try a demo here. Good old XP2, just because it just things a little bit easier from a disassembler perspective, but it could work on anything new. Same concept on something that's not ancient. Okay, so I'm not sure how many of you have used Immunity. Can I see a raise of hands of anybody that's actually familiar with this? Okay, so a few people. I'll go over it just really quick for those of you who have it. On the left side, this is actually the code that's being executed. On the right side, we have the registers. My computer is at risk, but it's host only, so don't try to do anything to it. Or you could, it won't. But then the top right side is all of our registers that the CPU uses to actually hold information temporarily while it's processing it, right? The bottom right part, which you can barely see, is our stack, which is a segment of memory, essentially, that you can add things onto and then take them back off. As a way to store things temporarily while you're processing something. So when you jump into a function, you throw things in the stack. When you jump back out, you pull it back off. So let's fill some registers here. So I'm going to fill them all with -1. So you can see all the 4 registers in the top right corner have filled with Fs. Can everybody in the back see that? I know it's kind of small, but we're good? Okay, because Windows magnifier on XP2 sucks. Okay, so now we've got these 4 registers filled with the value. So if we want to clear a register, the normal way that you'll see that most compilers will do that is doing something like a exclusive OR for the register against itself, right? So if you exclusive OR something against itself, it always becomes 0, and you can see that the top register has become 0. So if we have code that has exclusive ORs for a register, we can substitute that for something else. I'm going to show you a few different ways that we can do that. So the easiest one will be substitute or move the value of 0 into the register. So as I do that, you'll see the next register in the list will change to 0. So we get the exact same effect, but in both cases, there's 2 different ways to do it. Anybody that's written shellcode before, what's wrong with the second solution right there? Nulls. Yeah, very good. So certain times, if you're doing string format overflows, the null byte will end up killing the whole thing, and it won't work. So there's another way we can do this, right? Let's go ahead and move -1 into EDX, which it already was, so it's not going to change at all. But then let's increment that value by 1. Right now we're back to 0, and that could have been at anything, right? So prior to setting it to -1. So now we don't have any nulls. The code is no longer exclusive OR, but we get the exact same result. Let's get another one. So this one has a null, but you can push a value onto the stack, right? And then you can pop it right back off. And now you can see that the register is set to 0. There are a ton of ways that you can do this, and you can get super creative with it. So let's go ahead and do a couple other things that you could do to mess with the code. So who's familiar with the no operation, or NOP? Right, it essentially says do nothing. So you can throw a bunch of those in. That's actually what I threw in to separate out the code so you could see it a little bit better. It just says just skip this. It's used for padding. So let's go ahead and take EAX. I set it to Derby in hex. So let's increment EAX, right? And then let's decrement it again. So now we're back to exactly where we left off. We can go ahead and push ECX and pop it right back into ECX. Right now we're exactly where we were. The cool thing with that one is that you can actually do a bunch of crazy stuff in between the push and the pop, so long as that register never gets used. So here we're going to push the value of EDX to the stack. We're going to do some other things to obfuscate the code a little bit more with that EDX value, right? We're going to put pop into the EDX. And then we're going to go ahead and pull it back off the stack so that we're back to where we were before. Here's one of my favorite ones. This is kind of hard to see. This one is really hard to evolve, but it is really effective, at least from what I've seen. So here we have a jump short, right? If you look at this, that looks like really legitimate code, and you can have up to 255 bytes of code to do the jump short. So here what I'm going to do though is I've got the jump short followed by a bunch of fake code. When I do the jump short, it's going to jump over everything, right? So now I can add whatever I want in between it to try to obfuscate the code further. So any questions on that? Nope. Okay. Let's see if I can get back into the presentation. All right, so now the next part of it, evolution. This is by no means going to be complete, but quick overview of the concept, right? So you have something that's simple, and it gets put into an environment in which it needs to survive, right? In order for it to survive, it has to continue to replicate, right? So you can have something and say that, you know, in living beings we have DNA, right? So we have essentially 4 pieces of code that can be changed to come up with different protein sequences that essentially determine what we are as an organism. And let's say that something goes wrong in the process of duplication, right? And one of those, you know, I'll call it bit for the sake of keeping it to technology, flips. Then that organism will most often die, right? Like if things change, usually something bad will happen. Or in the case of us, we have redundancy, right? We have 2 of each. So we usually will survive most of the time unless it's really bad and causes cancer, right? But almost all changes are bad, but occasionally you'll get one change, a minor change that will cause something positive to happen, right? And this is a way oversimplification, right? Usually you get duplication of a gene and then one of the 2 genes will change. And but the idea is with enough time and enough minor mutations, everything that doesn't work will die off. And everything that does work will stay and continue to pass on what did work to the next generation. So we can apply we can apply that same idea with genetic algorithms in software. So I've summed it up into a few different steps, right? So we can create an initial population. I'm going to show you a demo that kind of works for mutating shellcode. It's got some problems, and I'll talk about what those are and how I'm trying to get past them for future iterations. But we create an initial population. So what I've actually been working off of is the Meterpreter reverse TCP stager. Right? That's a common one. You use it for a lot of the connections that you would want to get for any payload you want to drop on a system. That's a handy one. So we create the initial population. Then we mutate that population. So I say, let's create 100,000 clones, and let's mutate them all. And what I end up doing in my code is I say, okay, let's pick a value between 0 and x. And if x is too high, then too much mutation happens, and the organism usually dies, organism being code. If too few are mutated, then it doesn't change much, and I don't see a lot of change over generations. And so I right now have a value of 7 or 8, but I'm sure if my mutagens, which I'll show you in a minute, are better, that could be a much higher number. So we mutate everything in the population. So we have, I put back the original value, right? So we have the original code and all these different mutations of that code. And then we run a fitness test. Neil Bridges, the other guy that was going to be here, had to teach a SANS class, or got to teach a SANS class, however you'd like to look at it. He worked on a lot of our fitness test portion of this. And this is actually tricky. I'm sure there's a better way to automate it than what we did, but essentially what we needed to do is we ran it through a formula that said 1 if it's alive times by the percentage of AV that it got past, right? So we'd get back a score. And then depending on that score, it would determine how far it got off to the next generation. Unfortunately, for various reasons, we didn't get down very many generations before things started dying. So it's a bug in my code, but we're getting closer. And this is the next step is have sex. So you take all this code that you've mutated, right? And after the fitness test, you know what survives well and what doesn't survive well. And so I say everything that's beneath a fitness test of 0.8 or 0.4 or whatever the the average of the generation was, I say, okay, let's get rid of you, and everything else, go ahead and cross over. Let's mix and match yourselves to get a whole new generation, right? And then you do it again. So you go back to the beginning, you take that stuff that you've crossed over, you mutate it a little bit, you run through another fitness test, and you continue to do this over and over and over and over until you get something that will work as expected and gets past 100% of AV. So there were some challenges with this, and like I said, it doesn't work perfectly. I'm hoping to get it to work perfectly. But the disassembling process was very tricky. So Metasm is one of the best ways that I know to disassemble code in a scripting language. I'm using Ruby for most of my code. Metasm is great, but sometimes it gets confused, as would any disassembler, especially with complicated shellcode. A lot of shellcode has some instructions that are like kind of tricky, and it's that way for a purpose. It's trying to get the shellcode as small and as efficient and with as few null bytes as possible. And so it didn't always disassemble things right, which if you're doing manual ghostwriting, it's fine, because you, as a human, can say this isn't right, I'm going to fix it, and then it'll be good. When you're trying to automate it, 100,000 times in a short amount of time, then you have to have it disassemble perfect. And so one of the options I looked at was going back and actually rewriting a lot of the Metasm CPUs to actually have it disassemble the code right. But then I decided that was way over my head and would not be able to get that done before my talk. So my next idea was, well, why don't I just separate out all the different code into different bits, or bytes, essentially. And then I'll set each of those bytes into an array within an array. So what that did is that set it up so that I could actually rotate the code on that crossover function, right? So if I add or change any given piece of code, it's always going to essentially be in the exact same location. And so I ran that through. It worked great. My shell code was like mutating like crazy, and it was it did the exact same thing, but was completely different through various iterations. And so I got all excited, and then I started to run it against actual shell code, like this reverse TCP, and it started breaking. From what I've described, I don't know if I described it well enough, but anybody have any ideas as why that might be? So if you actually disassemble, and I don't think I'm going to have time. If you'd like to see it, I can show you afterwards. I can run through how the reverse TCP stager works. It actually does a lot of relative jumps, like I showed you earlier, where it jumps from one piece of code to the next. But when it said jump forward 8 bytes, and I added 2 more bytes as a part of my evolution, then all of a sudden when it jumped forward 8 bytes, unless those things were NOPs, it would die. And so what I was finding was there was like 3 or 4 places that it would mutate really, really well. And so it would like just go crazy there because it didn't screw with any of the jumps, but everywhere else it wouldn't mutate, it would just die. So that's something I'm working on fixing. the next iteration of the tool that I'm working on is actually going to attempt to decompile, change, and then recompile the code manually. But then again, that goes back to having to rewrite Metasm CPUs and trying to get that to all work appropriately. So then again, so the crossover is addition, subtraction, substitutions. That's where I see the problems with the jumps. So I'll show you one more demo. You can actually see it work, hopefully. Maybe. All right, so really quick, you can look at the code. I'll walk through it really quick, so if you don't code in Ruby, it should make sense. I essentially start a framework. This is what holds all the different mutagens and compilers that I use. I then load the shellcode example and parse it into something that we'll be able to understand or interpret. From there, I will go ahead and create a shellcode object, which is that formatted shellcode. Next, I'll create a pool. So this is creating that initial population. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and use 20 just for the sake of the demo. But normally that would be much, much larger. And then that pool is going to essentially get filled with shellcode objects, but that are all mutated slightly. The next, I'm going to go ahead and run it through a compiler that's going to compile everything back into an executable. So, and then after this, we'd run the fitness test, get the results, and then take everything that did work, and then run another generation of this. So I'll show you what it looks like. Actually, before I actually run it, I'll show you what some of the code of the different mutagens look like. This is everything that I've defined so far. I tried to kind of make it look like Metasploit so other people could use it. I don't think anybody will since it doesn't work perfect yet. But when it does work, trying to do this. Right, so here we essentially define a set of targets. If it's empty, it's going to go after everything. And then we define what we actually want it to mutate. So in this case, it's just adding a value of 90, which is not to the end of the string. Right, you can do a lot of more creative things with matching certain values and substituting them with other things. Okay, so now I'll go and run it. Sorry, that's tricky. Okay, so you can see exactly what it's doing. So each one of these is a new mutation that it will do from one of those 20 values. And I had it output more than it normally does, but you can see it creates a new mutant and then it does a whole bunch of replace functions. So here we're essentially changing that shellcode to something new. We're doing that automated ghost writing. And then at the very end, it compiles it. And so if we go to our output folder, you can see all the different variants of the C code that's generated as well as the final executable. That would then go into the fitness test. So that's how it works as of now. I will probably be releasing code shortly. I was planning on releasing it today, but because it's not working perfect, I figure I'd rather get it right before I release it. That said, if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to share it with you. The only reason I'm not releasing it is just because my code's ugly and I want to make it look nice. But if anybody's interested, like I said, talk to me afterwards. So quickly, since we only have a few more minutes, I think it's worth considering that change is exponential, right? If you remember the graph earlier, you can see that the malware is evolving exponentially. As computers move more towards genetic algorithms and neural networks, we're going to also see that the rate at which bad things occur will grow exponentially as well. You know, we're hoping that technology will evolve and come up with these great AI solutions, but the same thing can happen from the malicious perspective. And so one of the things that we need to do is consider many, many different layers, right? I say AV is a hard solution. If we get sick, we don't say, my immunity, it sucks. And if we do, we're not really like actually referencing our immunity. It was just that, and we also definitely don't say like, oh, my immunity sucks, I should just get rid of it, right? So I think that AV is probably overpriced a lot of times. It's probably not as much of the bang for the buck, but I still don't think, I think it's overpriced because it's a difficult solution, right? Or a difficult challenge. So I think one of the things that we should do moving forward is consider the way that nature evolves solutions. One of the things that I would like to see is AV vendors trying to actually evolve signatures that work better, right? So let's take a whole bunch of malware and let's try to evolve solutions that give us a percentage of how likely something is bad. And we actually do see that, and a couple vendors are starting to play with that, but I think that that's the direction that we need to go. And then redundancy, right? Let's not ever trust one particular thing. Let's not just say AV is a solution or the firewall or the WAF, or IDS, IPS. Let's add as much redundancy in the systems as possible. So sorry that was scattered and I was kind of rushed. Sorry for getting a late start. Are there any questions? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so good question. We've tried to automate that as much as possible. Right now, the way that we have it is we have that output folder, right? So we run a generation, we essentially zip it up, and I send it to the other guy that was here, Neil, and he takes each executable and pushes it to a VM, which will then test to see whether it works. If it works, it comes back with a 1. If it's a 1, he'll then push it to a series of AV boxes to see whether it gets detected, and he tries to use their APIs. There are AV API, and Neil could talk about this more than I could, but the APIs are a little bit tricky. So we had to do some fun things like looking at logs that may come out and whether they did or didn't. And so, but ultimately, that's what ends up in the score, right? So if we have 10 AV vendors that we're looking at and it got caught by got past 8 of them, then 0.8 times 1 is 0.8, and so that's our final fitness score. Correct, right? And so you can make fitness much more advanced. The better your fitness test, essentially the better product you're going to finally get, right? So that was just kind of the easy solution for this go around, but there are definitely better ways you could do that. I saw a hand. Yep, it's long and we should all go get drinks afterwards.
There are some combinations of what you're trying to do and whether your statements are defined for the swapping that will not work, and those will die. And what you must do, I think, is look at the structure of which opcodes work for swapping, which don't, and there is a death sequence.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I don't know if everybody in the back heard, but basically she's saying that certain functions, so these mutagens that I've defined, some of them aren't going to work, or it's likely to cause death every single time, right? So there are certain things that cause, like I said, most mutations end up being bad, but in this case, some mutations may end up being really bad, and I should just say, nope, we're going to get rid of that mutagen. It's just making this too much of a inefficient process. So the fitness function will take care of that. It will eventually kill itself off, just by the sake that whatever mutates that way will die, and then we don't see it in future populations. But you can make it a more efficient process, absolutely. So. Yep.
And I don't know about which instructions that you're looking at, but if they're offering different links, you might check whether you're verifying that the jump is within the instruction.
Right, that's exactly what was happening. Is I would add extra, like say add a NOP, right? Now it's not landing in the right spot, and that's why it was only evolving appropriately in a couple spots, is because those are the ones that weren't in your jump. So. I think we're out of time, but I will stick around for any extra questions that you guys may like. So thank you. I appreciate it, especially so late on a Friday night. Thank you.